The Samurai with European Blood, the story of William Adams. Archaeologists found bones buried on the Japanese island of Kyushu, and when the DNA results came back, they confirmed something historians had debated for over 400 years, that a man born in rural England had become something Japan had never seen before or since. But to understand what that means, you have to go back to the year 1600, and to a ship in pieces. The Dutch vessel Liefde had been at sea for nearly 2 years when it limped into the waters off Kyushu in April of 1600. Of the original crew of 110, fewer than 24 were still alive, and most of those were too ill to stand. The ship itself was barely holding together, its cargo depleted, its sails in tatters, its hull damaged from months of storms and disease. Among the survivors was an Englishman named William Adams. He was 36 years old, a trained navigator and mathematician from Gillingham, Kent, and he had never intended to end up in Japan. He had signed on as the Liefde's chief pilot, its principal navigator, as part of a Dutch trading expedition that aimed to reach the Spice Islands in what is now Indonesia. Japan was not the destination. Japan was the accident. To the Japanese who boarded the wreck, the Europeans were a category of person they had encountered before but never fully understood. The Nanban, the southern barbarians, as Portuguese and Spanish traders were known in Japan at the time. They arrived from the sea, they spoke no intelligible language, they carried firearms, and they brought with them a religion, Christianity, that the Japanese leadership viewed with deep political suspicion, not least because the Jesuit missionaries who had been in Japan for decades were widely suspected of loyalty to Rome over any local authority. Adams and his crewmates were taken ashore, placed under guard in a local lord's compound, and held while word was sent inland. The message was going to a man whose decision would change William Adams's life permanently, and who was, at that very moment, on the cusp of changing Japan's history entirely. That man was Tokugawa Ieyasu, and he was weeks away from the battle that would make him the most powerful person in the country. Historical records found in the Tokugawa archives, documents that survived Japan's centuries of conflict and are now held by institutions in Tokyo, describe a series of meetings between William Adams and Tokugawa Ieyasu that began in the spring of 1600 and continued on and off for nearly 2 decades. They are remarkable documents, not because they record grand diplomatic exchanges, but because they record something far more unusual. 2 men from entirely different worlds finding, across language barriers and cultural chasms, something they could actually talk about. Ieyasu was on the verge of becoming the most powerful man in Japan. The long civil war period, known as the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States, was drawing to a close, and Ieyasu's faction was winning. Within months of meeting Adams, he would triumph at the Battle of Sekigahara and begin consolidating the rule that would define Japan for the next 2.5 centuries. He was also, by all accounts, intensely curious, and what Adams could offer, knowledge of European mathematics, astronomy, navigation, and the design and manufacture of ocean-going vessels, was something Ieyasu could not get from anyone else in Japan. The Portuguese Jesuits, who had been in Japan for decades, had brought Christianity and some Western goods, but they had carefully avoided sharing technical knowledge that might reduce Japanese dependency on European trade. Adams had no such agenda. He answered questions directly. He drew diagrams. He explained how European cannon were made and how they were aimed. Ieyasu ordered that Adams not be allowed to leave. The Portuguese missionaries, who correctly identified Adams as a threat to their monopoly on European influence, lobbied for his imprisonment. Ieyasu ignored them. Adams had arrived as a castaway. He was becoming something else. Letters found in the British Library, written by William Adams himself and sent to the East India Company, contain a line that historians return to repeatedly. He writes that William Adams, the man who left England, is as a dead man to the world. The words were meant practically, but they carry a weight that goes beyond logistics. In 1604, Tokugawa Ieyasu formally granted Adams a new identity. He was given the name Miura Anjin, the pilot of Miura, after the peninsula south of what is now Tokyo, where he was given a feudal estate. He was given the rank of Hatamoto, a high-ranking samurai who reported directly to the shogun and was entitled to carry 2 swords. No foreigner had ever been granted this status. None would be again for centuries. The estate came with land, servants, and income. Adams built 2 Western-style ships for Ieyasu, a task that occupied much of 1604 and 1605, and that demonstrated his value as an engineer and practical builder in a way that no amount of conversation could match. The ships were used for trade missions to Southeast Asia. He also married. His English wife, Mary Hinn, remained in Gillingham with their children. Adams knew he would not return to England while Ieyasu lived. He wrote to Mary, "The letters show a man who accepted his situation but found it painful, and arranged for money to be sent to her through the East India Company." In Japan, he and a Japanese woman named Oyuki had 2 children, a son named Joseph and a daughter named Susanna. He lived in a house built in the Japanese style. He learned the language. He wore the clothing. He observed the customs. But in his letters, he remained English. He negotiated trade deals for British merchants. He complained about the Portuguese. He described Japanese court politics with the eye of an outsider who had learned to navigate them. He was 2 people at once, and the distance between them never fully closed. Archivists found a single entry in a 17th-century Portuguese trade document noting the passing of the English pilot at Hirado in 1620. It is one of the few contemporary Western references to the death of William Adams. The Japanese records are more detailed, but equally frustrating on the key question: where exactly was he buried? Adams died at Hirado, a port town on the northwestern coast of Kyushu, where he had been managing trade operations for the East India Company in its final years of Japanese activity. He was 56 years old. The cause of death is not recorded with medical specificity in surviving documents. He had been in declining health for the final years of his life, the cumulative effect of years at sea and the strain of managing commercial operations in an increasingly hostile political environment. He left a will, held in the UK National Archives, carefully dividing his property between his English family in Gillingham and his Japanese family in the Miura region. It is a precise, practical document. It is also, between its lines, the work of a man who knew he was not going home. What he did not leave was a clearly marked grave. The political upheaval that followed his death, Japan's steady move toward total closure, meant that sites associated with foreign presence were not maintained or honored. Within 2 decades, the Tokugawa government was systematically eliminating institutional traces of Western influence. Memorials to a foreign samurai, however distinguished, were not a priority. By the 18th century, the precise location of Adams's burial was effectively lost. In 1931, a memorial stone was erected at a site in Hirado believed to mark his resting place. Believed, but not verified. No excavation had ever been done. No bones had been examined. It was tradition, not evidence. In 2017, a team of archaeologists finally decided to look properly. Scientists found bone fragments at the Hirado excavation site in 2017, and what the laboratory results revealed became one of the most discussed forensic discoveries in Japanese archaeological history. The excavation was conducted by Japanese archaeologists working in the area designated as a memorial park. When researchers cleared a section of the burial area, they found fragmentary human remains, enough bone to attempt analysis, but not a complete skeleton. The first challenge was the condition of the material. The soil in the Hirado region is acidic, and acid soil is the enemy of ancient DNA. Breaking down genetic material over time and leaving fragments that are difficult to read. The team sent samples to a university laboratory for analysis. The technique used was mitochondrial DNA sequencing, a method that reads genetic material passed through the maternal line and is particularly useful for ancient samples because mitochondrial DNA is more abundant and more durable than nuclear DNA. The results identified the individual's haplogroup as consistent with Northern European ancestry, specifically with populations from the British Isles and Northern Europe. This was not Japanese bone. The genetic profile pointed clearly to someone whose maternal ancestry traced back to northwestern Europe. Isotope analysis of the tooth enamel supported the finding from a different direction. The chemical signature embedded in the teeth during childhood showed a pattern consistent with someone who grew up drinking water from a temperate northern environment, consistent with England. Carbon dating placed the burial within a window that included the early 17th century. 3 independent lines of evidence, DNA, isotopes, and carbon dating, pointed toward the same conclusion. Policy documents found in the Tokugawa administrative records show that the decision to close Japan was not made all at once. It was a series of edicts issued between 1633 and 1639 that progressively eliminated the presence of foreigners, their trade, their religion, and their physical proximity to Japanese life. William Adams had died in 1620. He did not live to see the country he had adopted seal itself from the world. But his story became, in retrospect, a kind of historical hinge point, the last moment before the door closed on the kind of exchange he represented. The Sakoku period, Japan's era of enforced isolation, lasted for approximately 250 years. During that time, the only foreigners permitted in Japan were a small number of Dutch traders, confined to a tiny artificial island in Nagasaki harbor called Dejima. They were not allowed to bring wives. They were not allowed to leave the island freely. They were monitored continuously. The contrast with Adams's status could not be more complete. Adams had ridden alongside the Shogun, owned land, commanded workers, and sat in on trade negotiations at the highest level. The Dutch at Dejima could not cross a bridge without permission. The closure had direct implications for Adams's legacy within Japan. His name was associated with the kind of foreign entanglement the Tokugawa government was committed to ending. Memorials to him were not encouraged. The trading networks he had helped build were dismantled. Most significantly for the question DNA researchers would later pursue, the presence of European bloodlines within Japanese society was something the era actively discouraged. Children of mixed heritage had 2 choices: leave Japan with whatever foreign connection remained, an option that closed entirely after 1639, or stay, assimilate, and become, in every practical sense, Japanese. The question of what happened to Adams's children, Joseph and Susanna, in this environment is one the documentary record cannot fully answer. But it is exactly the question that 4 centuries later, genetic science would try to address from a different direction entirely, not through archives, but through the DNA of living people. Genetic researchers found something unexpected when they began tracing the descendants of the Miura family name in the Kanagawa region of Japan. A faint but detectable signal of European ancestry in a small number of individuals whose families had lived in the area for generations. The search for Adams's descendants began as a parallel project to the Hirado excavation. Historians knew that Adams had 2 children with Oyuki, Joseph and Susanna Adams, whose names appear in their father's will. They knew that Joseph had been involved in the East India Company's Japan operations as a young man. After the closure of Japan, the documentary trail went cold. What happened to Joseph and Susanna after Sakoku is not recorded in any surviving document with certainty. The most likely scenario, according to historians, is that they remained in Japan, adopted Japanese identities, and assimilated into the local population. as survival under the isolationist regime essentially required. The genetic survey, conducted with consent from participating families, used targeted analysis to look for haplogroups associated with Northern European ancestry in communities with long historical ties to the Miura area. The findings were modest in scale. A small percentage of individuals showed traces consistent with European admixture at a level and pattern that suggested a single historical introduction, several generations back, rather than recent foreign ancestry. The researchers were careful about their conclusions. The evidence is suggestive, not definitive. A small trace of European haplogroup in a Japanese community does not prove direct descent from William Adams, but it is consistent with it. What the research confirmed, at minimum, was that the genetic legacy of cross-cultural contact in early 17th century Japan did not disappear entirely. It persisted, quietly, through generations of people who had no name for where it came from. Scholars found, when they examined the letters and accounts attributed to William Adams, that he was one of the first Europeans to describe the samurai value system in terms that Western readers could recognize and engage with, not as exotic ritual, but as a coherent ethical framework with parallels to European chivalric tradition. Adams was not a writer by profession. His surviving letters are practical documents, trade requests, complaints about competitors, logistical updates to company officials. But within them are observations about Japanese culture that historians now treat as primary source material of genuine value. He noted the emphasis on personal honor and loyalty, the concept encoded in Bushido, the way of the warrior, and compared it implicitly to the feudal obligations he had grown up understanding in England. A samurai's relationship to his lord was, in structure, not entirely unlike a knight's relationship to his sovereign. The specific customs were different. The underlying logic had points of contact. He also noted, with evident appreciation, aspects of Japanese domestic life that differed sharply from European norms of the period. Japanese bathing practice, the regular, ritual use of hot baths, was a source of particular comment. In early 17th century England, bathing was infrequent and associated with illness rather than hygiene. Adams described the Japanese approach as sensible. His accounts helped establish, for the small circle of East India Company officials who read them, a picture of Japan as a sophisticated civilization rather than a peripheral curiosity. The contrast between the katana, the Japanese sword, optimized for a specific cutting technique and requiring years of dedicated practice, and the European rapier, a thrusting weapon designed for a different kind of combat, became a recurring point of comparison in later scholarship, precisely because Adams and his contemporaries had the direct experience of observing both traditions in practiced hands. He was a navigator by training, but the record he left was cultural as much as commercial. Historians found, when they examined the sources carefully, that the story of William Adams had been told in ways that served different purposes at different times, and that separating the documented record from the mythology required more precision than popular accounts usually applied. The most significant controversy concerns Adams's actual influence on Tokugawa Ieyasu. Popular accounts, amplified enormously by James Clavell's novel Shogun, published in 1975, and its various television and streaming adaptations, present a figure of sweeping political consequence. A Western pilot who effectively shaped the strategy of the most powerful man in Japan. The historical record is more nuanced. Adams was valued, he was trusted, he was given exceptional status, but he was also, ultimately, an instrument of Ieyasu's own purposes. The shogun did not take strategic advice from his English navigator. He took technical knowledge and he used it as he chose. The question of whether the Hirado bones are definitively those of William Adams remains, strictly speaking, open. The DNA evidence is consistent with the identification. The isotope data supports it. The carbon dating is compatible. But forensic identification at this distance from fragmentary remains in degraded soil cannot reach the standard of certainty that the word confirmed usually implies. Researchers have been careful to say the evidence strongly supports the identification, not that it proves it beyond doubt. A separate controversy involves the broader practice of DNA analysis on historical remains at sites across Japan. The Hirado case generated academic debate about methodology, consent frameworks, and the appropriate handling of remains that may be connected to living communities. The Shogun adaptations have renewed public interest in Adam substantially, but historians note, with some consistency, that the dramatic version and the documented version of his life are not the same story. Researchers found, in the final accounting of William Adams's documented life, a man whose story resists the simple framing that history tends to prefer. He was not a conqueror. He was not a missionary. He was not a spy. He was a navigator who ended up in the wrong place at the right moment, and who spent the remaining 20 years of his life making something coherent from a situation he had never chosen. The annual Miura Anjin festival, held each April in Ito City on the Izu Peninsula, is a small but consistent ceremony that has continued for decades. Participants dress in period costume, both Japanese samurai attire and European sailor dress, and commemorate a man who, in his own lifetime, wore both. The event draws visitors from the UK, from the Netherlands, and from Japan, and is one of the few places in the world where the very specific history of early Anglo-Japanese contact is observed in physical form. The DNA findings from Hirado added a new dimension to that commemoration. Because the bones in the ground, if they are Adams's, and the evidence says they very likely are, represent something beyond an interesting historical footnote. They represent the physical remnant of a life that was genuinely lived between worlds. A man who held a samurai's rank and an Englishman's name, who had children in 2 countries and wrote letters to both, who helped build ships for a shogun and trade routes for a company based in London, whose will, written in a language his Japanese children probably did not speak, divided his possessions carefully between families who would never meet. The question of what it means to belong somewhere, to a place, to a people, to a name, is not one that DNA resolves. What it does is confirm the journey. The bones in the ground were European. The life that those bones lived was something that had no category before William Adams created it. He called Japan home. The record, 4 centuries later, agrees.